Hey there guys, unfortunately I have some bad news for you all. Gaijin just announced a new pack sale, which means that my fight against credit card debt will not be going very well this month. That being said, there are some very strong options in this one, so I'll try and cover each of these vehicles in as much detail in as short of a time frame as possible. Except boats, of course. Some helpful fellow in the comments who plays naval can review those for me. Thank you in advance. We'll be doing air first, then ground. Also, any of these vehicles which I've done full video reviews on will have the links to those reviews in the description below. Anyways, let's get straight into it.
Just do it!
First off, we have the MiG-21 Bison. If you're looking to grind out the British air tech tree, this is absolutely going to be your pick. It's basically a MiG-21 BIS, but with an upgraded radar, R-27s, R-73s, and an HMD, which makes you a serious threat to basically any aircraft you can face. Needless to say, easy A tier. Next we have the Su-25K. This is pretty straightforward. It grinds well in air RB, it's good CAS and ground RB, overall great value, so also going to be an A tier. Next we have the A-10, and as you might expect, everything I just said about the Su-25 also applies here. If you're a US main, you really can't go wrong with this thing, A tier. Now we finally get to our first stinker, the Tornado IDS. This is a flying brick at 11.3 with only 2 air-to-air missiles and no guided ordnance of any kind. Don't waste your money on this, wait for the Su-22 to go on sale. That thing is actually fantastic, and I have a full video on why. Anyways, this is going in Gaijin Y. Next we have the Mirage F1. I have a full video guide on this one if you want more info on how to use it, but it's a great little rat fighter. The radar missiles are complete garbage, but it's got Magic 2s, which are hilariously OP for this BR. Not the greatest thing ever, but still quite solid. I'm going to put this at B tier. Next we have the MiG-23 ML. This vehicle unfortunately had its flight performance nerfed a while ago, but it's still got pretty decent kit with R-24s and R-60Ms. This is a pretty middle-of-the-pack vehicle, so I'm just going to stick it in B tier. Now I get to one which I'm sure there's going to be some disagreement over, the F-20 Tiger Shark. So the airframe is great, this thing will tear the shit out of most of the vehicles it gets down tiered against. The problem with this thing is that it gets up tiered a lot at 12.7, which means it fights Fox 3s and IRCCM Fox 2s. Meanwhile, you're stuck with AIM-9Ls and AIM-7s, and you have to actually choose between 2 AIM-9s and 1 AIM-7 on those inner pylons, so overall this thing is just not really beginner friendly. I'm still going to stick it at B tier because I know some people quite like it, but if you want to buy it, just understand that it comes with some serious drawbacks. Next we have the MiG-21 BIS Lazar. This is basically just a premium copy-paste MiG-21 BIS, which can be pretty good in certain situations, but has kinda poor energy retention and not the most impressive weaponry. The R-60Ms are decent, but have very short range, and the R3Rs are fun to beam people in the face with in a head-on, but overall just not really super strong. I'd still recommend waiting for the Su-22, C tier. Next we have the F5C. This thing finally had its BR lowered to 10.7 recently, which was definitely a much needed improvement and will keep this thing from being up tiered nearly as much. It's a great airframe that holds its energy very well. Also the engines don't run very hot, which helps noticeably when you're trying to shake off heat seekers. The main drawback is the weaponry. For air-to-air it only gets 2 AIM-9Es, and for CAS there's nothing particularly impressive either. Overall still pretty decent though, so I'm gonna rank it B tier. Next we have the J-7D. This is basically a Chinese MiG-21 SMT. It has a weaker engine than the BIS, and it also only carries 4 missiles instead of 6. However, the missiles it carries are PL-5s and PL-7s, with PL-7s basically being an export Magic 1. These are rear aspect only, but are probably some of the strongest rear aspect only missiles in the game. For that reason, I'm actually going to stick this in B tier, because in spite of the limitations of the airframe, I just find these missiles incredibly effective and user-friendly. Next we have the Kfir Canard. This is basically a Mirage 5 with an F-104 engine stuck into it. It's 11.0 with only 2 rear aspect only heat seekers for air-to-air armament, and no particularly impressive air-to-ground armament either. For that reason, this is going in D tier. Next we have the AMX-A1. This is a Brazilian variant of the aircraft, and compared to the one in the tech tree, you trade the Vulcan cannon for 2 DEFAs, and instead of 9Ls, you get these unique Piranha all-aspect air-to-air missiles with 45 Gs of pull, which is pretty nuts. It also gets 6 guided bombs, which makes it usable in ground RB as well. That's some pretty decent value and versatility, so even though it's not the craziest thing ever, I still think this deserves a B tier. Next we have the P-51D-20, and I think the most notable thing about this aircraft is that it's rank 4, even though it only has a BR 4.0, so you can research extremely far into the tech tree with it. In terms of the aircraft itself, it's basically the same as the Tech Tree D5 with an improved rudder. At 4.0 though, I feel like there are better options, particularly the XP50 and the captured 109 F4, but I mean, if you like the P-51s, you'll like this too. I don't though, so I'm putting this in C tier. Next we have the Israeli Spitfire. I think I can be brief on this one. It's a late model Spitfire. Enough said, A tier. Next we have the P16. This one I have to admit I have not flown, nor am I particularly knowledgeable on it, but based on what I've gathered from people who have flown it, it has decent but not spectacular flight performance, very good high velocity 30mm cannons, AIM-9Bs, and pretty decent CAS options all at 9.0. I'm going to tentatively put this at B tier, but again with a caveat that I'm basing this off of second-hand information mostly. Lastly, we have the A5C. This is basically a MiG-19 with the 30mm cannons replaced with 23s, more thrust, but also a heavier airframe, and all the CCIP. And, most importantly, magic missiles. I have a whole video guide on the MiG-19 series, but long story short, use it like a fighter even though it's technically an attacker. Its air-to-ground ordnance is honestly pretty unimpressive. B tier. That's all for air. Now let's move on to ground. I'd like to start off this section by saying I would strongly advise you against buying your way into top tier ground at all if you're new. I promise you'll have an absolutely miserable experience if you do, much more so even than top tier air in my opinion. But with that out of the way, Challenger OES. I'd apologize to the British mains for what I'm about to say, but since I'm sure they're probably all well aware of this, I'll just go ahead and say it. This thing absolutely sucks. Do not buy it. Pretty much any part of this thing except the turret cheeks can be easily penned by any top tier dart round, and its driver's port and lower front plate are particularly awful weak spots. Its firepower is lackluster, and due to the increased weight from all the ERA combined with the lack of an upgraded engine, it has some of the worst mobility of any top tier vehicle, period. I think there's only one proper spot for this, Gaijin Y. Next we have a much stronger contender, the T-80U E1. If you've played a T-80 before, you know what you're getting into, but if you haven't, it's a very solid in terms of frontal protection. In terms of firepower, this one is a bit lackluster with only 3BM46, which is still perfectly usable, and weighing only 47 tons with an 1100 horsepower engine, it's extremely mobile. Obviously, it still has the same drawbacks as the other Russian top tiers with poor reverse speed and gun depression, but overall, I still find the T-80s to be extremely forgiving and user-friendly, so for that reason I put this at A tier. Next we have the Canadian Leopard 2. Now, I know this might look like a Leo 2A6, but in reality it's just a 2A4 with some Applique armor and a better shell added. The cheek armor will give you some level of useful protection, but the rest is really not. Aside from that, this thing is pretty much average, decent firepower, decent mobility, especially if you take off the mine protection and slat armor, which, by the way, you definitely should. I'm kind of on the fence about where to put this, but I think B is fair here. Next we have the M1 KVT. Not a lot to say about this one, it's just a well-balanced, mobile 10.7 MBT. Not bad, not outstanding. I think a solid B tier is fair here. Okay, the M1 clickbait. So I got some flack on this one in my last sale tier list for putting it at A tier, reason being that while it's much stronger than the other 11.7 premiums, with its frontal protection and firepower being comparable to the Tech Tree 12.0 MBTs, American teams are so absolutely god-awful at this BR that you're likely going to get your ass kicked regardless of how good you are. That being the case, I'm just going to stick it at B tier. Next we have the CV90-105. If you like glass cannons, you'll like this a lot. It has an auto-loading 105 with DM33, it's extremely mobile, has great thermals, has a laser warning receiver, and unusually for a Western vehicle, a barrel-launched ATGM, which has a tandem charge warhead and enough HE filler to overpressure light vehicles. This is a great little pickup. I put this at A tier. Next we have the K9 Vidar. It's a derp gun with thermals and a laser rangefinder at 8.0. Is it meta? No, although situationally you can do extremely well with it. Is it extremely funny though? Yes, absolutely, and for that reason, A tier. Next we have the Term 3. This is basically a design that trades all of its armor for mobility and firepower. It gets an auto-loading 105 and also a 30mm coaxial autocannon with APHE, which will absolutely shred light vehicles. It also has 12 degrees of gun depression, which makes it extremely effective on hilly maps. If you like an aggressive playstyle, this is a no-brainer, A tier. Next we have the Swoma SM, I don't know how to pronounce that word, but basically the best way I can explain this vehicle is take a King Tiger, give it an extremely crappy 40mm of side armor, a 1000 horsepower engine, and a weird French auto-loading oscillating turret with a 100mm gun, which has 273mm of flat pen, but no HE filler. I know some people love this thing, but the lack of HE filler drives me absolutely fucking nuts, so I'm gonna leave this at B tier. Next we have the legendary Bias 6. If I were making a video on this thing a few years ago, back when it was 7.0, this would easily go into OP, but at 7.7, this isn't quite as dominant. Its armor is so thick and heavily angled that it can still offer useful protection against CFS and darts, but with an ace reload speed of only 16 seconds and a gun depression of no, I'm hesitant to hype this thing up so much, so I'm just going to put it in B tier. Next we have the Challenger DS. Unlike the OES, this thing is actually at least serviceable for its BR. It has okay mobility, pretty crappy frontal protection aside from the turret cheeks, and quite good firepower for the BR. I feel comfortable giving this one a respectable C tier. Next we have the Diesel Tiger. This is my favorite tank in the game. I made a whole video about why. It has excellent armor, excellent firepower, decent mobility, and I would say that seal clubbing Shermans and T-34s in a down tier with this thing is probably the most fun you will ever have in War Thunder OP. Next we have the Type 16 FPS. This is a wheeled light tank at 9.3 with quite a few useful bells and whistles for the BR, such as a laser warning receiver and Gen 3 thermals, but obviously no armor. At 9.3, this thing mercifully doesn't get sucked up into the 10.7 hell, and we'll get to bully a bunch of 8.3 and 8.7 premiums. I usually don't like to rank niche vehicles this high, but this thing is just so dominant in the flanking and sniping role here that I think it deserves an A tier. Next we have the Type 96A prototype. At 10.3 it has pretty good firepower, with its top dart round getting 466mm of flat pen. Protection is pretty spotty, but the cheeks and upper front plate are quite strong. Mobility is average, and it also gets an electro-optical active protection system, which is a nice touch. Overall, not great, not terrible. I think B tier is fair here. Lastly, we have the M51W, which I'm pretty sure is just a copy and paste from the one in the tech tree, except with the roof-mounted 30 cal replaced by a 50. It performs about as well as you would expect for a hopelessly obsolete vehicle kept in service with upgraded firepower, which is to say, it punches pretty hard, but you're going to start running into problems if people start, actually shooting at you. If you like getting eaten alive by German big cats, this vehicle's for you. D tier. Anyways, guys, that's going to be it for this one. If you found this information helpful, please like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one.